Miss Marple and the cafe, where nobody ever left. Chapter 1. The Morning Routine. The brass bell above Elderbury Cottage's front door chimed with its customary cheerfulness as Miss Jane Marple stepped into the crisp October morning. The village of St. Mary Mead stretched before her like a watercolor painting, all golden leaves and morning mist clinging to the churchyard walls. At 73, Miss Marple had developed a fondness for early morning walks, not for the exercise, as her doctor had suggested, but for the delightful opportunity to observe her neighbors going about their daily rituals. She adjusted her wool, coat, and began her familiar route down Church Lane, past the rectory, where young Mr. Clement was already visible through his study window, no doubt preparing Sunday's sermon. The postman, Mr. Higgins, tipped his cap as he passed, his bag heavy with the morning's correspondence. Everything in St. Mary Mead moved with the precision of a well-wound clock, and Miss Marple found great comfort in this predictability. Her destination this morning was the Bluebell Café, a charming establishment that had opened 6 months prior in what had once been Mrs. Wetherby's tea shop. The new proprietress, Mrs. Vivian Hartwell, had transformed the modest space into something rather sophisticated for a village café. Whitewashed walls displayed local watercolors, and small round tables were set with crisp blue-checkered cloths. Most impressive of all was the collection of exotic teas Mrs. Hartwell had imported from London: Ceylon, Darjeeling, and something called Dragon Well, that Miss Marple found particularly intriguing. As she approached the café, Miss Marple noticed the usual morning crowd gathering. Mrs. Hartwell believed in prompt service, opening precisely at 8 o'clock each day, and her regulars had quickly adapted to this schedule. Through the large front window, Miss Marple could see several familiar faces already seated with their morning cups. There was Colonel Melrose, retired military man and permanent bachelor, who occupied the corner table each morning at 8:15 sharp. He always ordered black coffee and a buttered scone, read the Times from cover to cover, and departed at precisely 9 o'clock. Across from him sat Mrs. Bantry, the magistrate's wife, who had developed an unfortunate habit of discussing village affairs in a voice that carried rather more than she intended. Near the window, Miss Marple spotted young Dr. Haydock's wife, Sarah, stirring her tea with unusual vigor, while engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley, the village busybody whose tongue wagged more frequently than her ancient spaniel's tail. Both women seemed unusually animated this morning, their heads bent together in the conspiratorial manner that suggested gossip of the highest order. Miss Marple pushed open the cafe door, setting off a delicate silver bell that Mrs. Hartwell had installed to announce each arrival. The proprietress looked up from behind the counter, her face brightening with genuine pleasure. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you this morning. Your usual table is ready." Vivian Hartwell was a woman of perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair that she wore in an elegant chignon, and eyes the color of winter seas. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead under circumstances that the village found tantalizingly mysterious. A widow, she claimed, seeking a quiet life after her husband's death in India. She spoke with the refined accent of someone educated in good schools, yet there was something indefinably guarded about her manner that suggested secrets carefully kept. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into her preferred seat near the back of the cafe. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire room while appearing to focus on her knitting or the morning paper. "I believe I'll try that Ceylon blend again. It was quite exceptional yesterday." As Mrs. Hartwell prepared her tea, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander across the cafe's other occupants. The morning routine was comfortingly familiar, yet something felt different today. There was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't quite place, a subtle shift in the usual atmosphere. Mrs. Bantry's voice rose above the general murmur. "I simply cannot believe she would do such a thing. After all these years in the village, to think that she would—" Her words were abruptly cut off as she noticed Miss Marple's arrival, and she lowered her voice to a more discreet whisper. Colonel Melrose rustled his newspaper with unnecessary force, his usual composure seeming somewhat strained. Dr. Haydock's wife continued stirring her tea long after any reasonable person would have stopped, her spoon clinking against the china with increasing frequency. Even Mrs. Hartwell seemed affected by whatever had disturbed the morning's peace. As she brought Miss Marple's tea, her usually steady hands trembled slightly, and she cast nervous glances toward the front door, as if expecting someone unwelcome to arrive. "Is everything quite all right, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired gently, accepting her teacup with its delicate pattern of blue forget-me-nots. Mrs. Hartwell's smile appeared forced. "Oh yes, perfectly fine. Just a bit of village gossip, you know how it is. Nothing that concerns anyone, really." But Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead far too long to be deceived by such reassurances. Village gossip, in her considerable experience, always concerned someone, and usually that someone was more deeply involved than they initially appeared. She settled back in her chair, preparing to observe and listen with the particular attention she reserved for situations that weren't quite what they seemed. The morning was about to become far more interesting than anyone expected, though none of the cafe's patrons could have imagined just how dramatically their peaceful routine was about to be shattered. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. Miss Marple had barely taken her first sip of Ceylon tea when the cafe door burst open with such force that the delicate silver bell rang out like an alarm. Mrs. Dorothy Clement, the rector's wife, stood framed in the doorway, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled and her face flushed with excitement and distress. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, pressing a gloved hand to her chest. "Has anyone seen— that is, I've just come from—" She paused, seeming to notice the cafe's occupants for the first time. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the expectant faces all turned toward her. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I simply must ask, has anyone seen Miss Fortescue this morning?" A collective intake of breath greeted this announcement. Miss Fortescue was the village's retired schoolmistress, a formidable woman of 70 who had taught half the current population their letters and maintained strict routines that had remained unchanged for decades. She took her morning constitutional at 7:30 sharp, attended early communion at 8, and was invariably seated at the Bluebell Café by 8:45 for her daily cup of Earl Grey and single digestive biscuit. Miss Marple glanced at the ornate clock above the counter. It was now 9:15, and Miss Fortescue's usual table by the door remained conspicuously empty. Colonel Melrose lowered his newspaper with a sharp rustle. Not seen her at all this morning, Mrs. Clement. Most unusual, I must say. Woman's more punctual than Big Ben. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward in her chair, her morning gossip momentarily forgotten in favor of this new development. You don't suppose she's taken ill? At her age, one never knows. That's precisely what I thought, Mrs. Clement interrupted, wringing her hands. So I went round to Rosemary Cottage to check on her. The front door was standing wide open, which you know is most unlike Miss Fortescue. She's terribly particular about security ever since that business with the gypsies last summer. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice rose to its customary shrill pitch. Wide open? How very peculiar. What did you find inside? Mrs. Clement's complexion grew, even paler. That's just it, I called out, but there was no answer. The sitting room looked perfectly normal. Tea tray set out for breakfast, morning paper folded beside her chair. But her bedroom. She paused dramatically, clearly relishing the attention. Her bed hadn't been slept in. The coverlet was still, perfectly smooth, pillows undisturbed. Dr. Haydock's wife, Sarah, set down her teacup with a sharp click. Perhaps she spent the night elsewhere, though I can't imagine where. Miss Fortescue isn't one for social visits. Mrs. Hartwell emerged from behind the counter, her face creased with concern. This is most disturbing. Miss Fortescue has been coming here every morning since I opened. She's as reliable as sunrise. She twisted her hands in her apron. Yesterday, she seemed perfectly well, though perhaps a bit preoccupied. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythmic clicking. Preoccupied, you say? In what way, my dear? Well, Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if checking for eavesdroppers. She kept looking toward the door, as if she were expecting someone. And she asked me the oddest question. Wanted to know if I'd noticed anyone new in the village lately, anyone who might be watching. Colonel Melrose straightened in his chair. Watching? Whatever did she mean by that? I haven't the faintest idea. She wouldn't elaborate, just paid her bill and left rather hurriedly. Most unlike her usual manner. Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with the particular light that appeared when she scented a mystery. Mark my words, there's more to this than meets the eye. Miss Fortescue was acting strangely yesterday afternoon as well. I saw her walking past the church 3 times, as if she were building up courage to go in. Did she eventually enter? Miss Marple inquired mildly, though her attention was now fully focused on the conversation. That's the peculiar thing. She did, but she was only inside for a few minutes. When she came out, she looked quite shaken, white as a sheet she was. Mrs. Clement nodded vigorously. Yes, my husband mentioned that someone had been to see him yesterday evening, but he wouldn't say who. You know how discretion-bound he is about pastoral matters. But he seemed rather troubled afterward. The cafe had grown unusually quiet, the usual cheerful chatter replaced by an atmosphere of growing unease. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Hartwell had grown increasingly pale during the conversation, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to be outdone in dramatic speculation, leaned forward conspiratorially. I hate to say it, but there was something else odd yesterday. I was walking past the post office around 4 o'clock when I saw Miss Fortescue coming out looking quite agitated. She was clutching a letter. Looked like official correspondence, you know. with one of those typed addresses and a London postmark. Letter from London? Colonel Melrose frowned. Miss Fortescue doesn't have family in London, does she? Not that anyone knows of, Mrs. Bantry replied. She's always been quite secretive about her past. Came here 30 years ago to take the teaching position and never spoke of her life before. We all assumed there was nothing worth mentioning. Mrs. Clement wrung her hands again. What should we do? Shouldn't we notify the police? It's been over 12 hours since anyone saw her. Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. Perhaps we should give it a little more time. People do, occasionally, break their routines, even creatures of habit like Miss Fortescue. Though I must admit, the circumstances do seem rather unusual. She glanced around the cafe, noting the various expressions of concern, curiosity, and what might have been guilt on the faces surrounding her. In her long experience, when a village was united in discussing one person's disappearance, there was usually someone present who knew more than they were willing to admit. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, but it seemed to Miss Marple that the light had grown considerably dimmer since Mrs. Clement's dramatic entrance. Something was very wrong in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Fortescue's empty chair was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The cafe's atmosphere had shifted from comfortable morning routine to anxious speculation when the door opened once more, this time admitting Police Constable Frank Lamb. The young officer's usually cheerful demeanor was noticeably subdued as he removed his helmet and nodded to the assembled company. "Morning all," he said, his voice carrying an official tone that immediately silenced the remaining conversations. "I wonder if I might have a word with anyone who's seen Miss Fortescue recently." Mrs. Clement stepped forward eagerly. "Oh, Constable Lamb, I'm so glad you're here. I've just been telling everyone about finding her cottage empty this morning. Most peculiar circumstances." Constable Lamb withdrew a small notebook from his breast pocket, a gesture that elevated the morning's gossip to something more serious. Miss Marple observed how this simple action changed the room's dynamic. Backs straightened, voices lowered, and expressions became more guarded. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Clement. The rector telephoned the station an hour ago. Now then, when did anyone last see Miss Fortescue?" Colonel Melrose cleared his throat importantly. "All saw her yesterday afternoon around 3 o'clock, walking past the War Memorial. She was moving rather purposefully, I thought. Not her usual leisurely pace." "Which direction was she heading, sir?" "Toward the church, though she seemed to be taking the long way round. Went past the memorial, down Vicarage Lane, then doubled back through the cemetery. Odd route considering," Mrs. Bantry interjected. "I mentioned to Mrs. Clement that I saw her enter the church yesterday, but she was only inside briefly. Came out looking quite distressed." Constable Lamb scribbled notes diligently. "Anyone else observe Miss Fortescue yesterday?" Mrs. Price Ridley raised her hand, as if she was still in one of Miss Fortescue's classes. "I saw her at the post office. She'd received a letter that seemed to upset her considerably. From London, by the look of it." "Did you happen to notice the return address, ma'am?" "Well, I wasn't deliberately prying, you understand," Mrs. Price Ridley replied with obvious insincerity. "But it appeared to be from some sort of legal firm. Pemberton and Associates, I believe." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused imperceptibly. Legal correspondence often preceded either very good news or very bad news. and in her experience, mysterious disappearances rarely followed receipt of the former. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been unusually quiet during the constable's questioning, suddenly spoke up. She was here yesterday morning as usual, but she seemed different, distracted. She kept checking her watch and glancing toward the door. What time did she leave, Mrs. Hartwell? Earlier than usual. Normally she stays until 9:30, but yesterday she left just after 9. And she asked me. Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, wringing her hands. She asked if I'd noticed anyone new in the village, anyone who might be watching people. Constable Lamb looked up from his notebook with increased interest. Watching people. Did she elaborate on what she meant? No, she wouldn't say more. Just paid her bill and left rather quickly. Dr. Haydock's wife, Sarah, who had been stirring her now cold tea throughout the interview, suddenly spoke. There was something else. My husband mentioned that Miss Fortescue had scheduled an appointment to see him this morning. 9:30 sharp. She said it was urgent. Medical appointment, Constable Lamb inquired. That's the strange part. She wouldn't specify what it concerned. Just said she needed to discuss something important with him. She seemed quite insistent about the time. Miss Marple found this detail particularly intriguing. Miss Fortescue was not known for medical appointments. She possessed the robust constitution of someone who regarded illness as a personal failing. An urgent consultation suggested something beyond physical ailments. Has anyone checked the railway station? Colonel Melrose suggested. Perhaps she's taken an unexpected trip to London. That letter might have summoned her on business. Constable Lamb nodded. First thing we did, sir. Station master confirms no one matching Miss Fortescue's description purchased a ticket yesterday or this morning. Bus driver says the same. Nobody of her age or appearance on any of yesterday's services. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. What about that new man who's been staying at the Lamb and Flag? Arrived last week, hasn't he? Very secretive about his business here. What new man? Several voices asked simultaneously. Tall fellow, well-dressed, London accent. Calls himself Mr. Peterson, though I suspect that's not his real name. Has the look of someone in an official capacity, if you ask me, government or legal, I'd say. Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. A mysterious stranger arriving just days before a long-time resident's disappearance was precisely the sort of coincidence that, in her experience, was rarely coincidental at all. Constable Lamb made another note. I'll have a word with him. Anyone else notice this Mr. Peterson about the village? Mrs. Hartwell's face had grown quite pale. He came in here yesterday afternoon, ordered coffee, and sat in the corner for nearly an hour. He seemed to be watching the other customers rather than reading his newspaper. Did he speak to anyone? Not directly, but... Mrs. Hartwell's voice became almost a whisper. I had the distinct impression he was waiting for someone. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the door, much like Miss Fortescue had done in the morning. The cafe fell silent as the implications of this information settled over the group. Two people, both acting unusually, both watching and waiting for someone on the same day that one of them subsequently disappeared. Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and placed it in her bag. Constable Lamb, I wonder if you might allow me to accompany you to Miss Fortescue's cottage. I've known her for many years, and sometimes an outsider's eye notices things that official investigations might overlook. The young constable looked uncertain. "Well, Miss Marple, it's not strictly regulation, but I suppose there's no harm. Your reputation for observational skills is well known in these parts." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple caught Mrs. Hartwell's eye. The cafe owner was wringing her hands again, and there was something in her expression that suggested fear rather than mere concern. Whatever was happening in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple suspected that more than one person in the room knew more than they were willing to admit. Chapter 4. First suspects. Rosemary Cottage stood at the end of Elm Tree Lane, a tidy brick dwelling with leaded windows and a garden that reflected Miss Fortescue's precise nature. Every rosebush was properly pruned, every border edge perfectly maintained, and the small front lawn showed the geometric patterns of recent mowing. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she walked beside Constable Lamb, exactly the sort of home one would expect from a retired schoolmistress who had spent 40 years imposing order upon unruly children. The front door stood slightly ajar, just as Mrs. Clement had described. Constable Lamb pushed it open carefully, calling out, "Miss Fortescue, police here, ma'am. Are you at home?" Silence greeted them, heavy and somehow ominous in the morning stillness. Miss Marple followed the constable into the small hallway, her experienced eye immediately cataloguing details that spoke of the cottage's absent occupant. The sitting room was immaculate, as expected. Miss Fortescue's armchair sat beside the fireplace, a book placed face down on the side table, as if she had merely stepped away for a moment. The morning newspaper lay folded beside it, still in its delivery position, clearly unopened. This struck Miss Marple as significant. Miss Fortescue was known to read her paper thoroughly over breakfast each morning. Tea trays still set out, Constable Lamb observed, noting the single cup and saucer on the small table, the unused spoon beside them. Miss Marple approached the mantelpiece, where a collection of photographs displayed Miss Fortescue's life in careful arrangement. Most were formal school groups from her teaching years, but one frame caught her attention, a photograph that seemed oddly positioned, as if it had been recently handled. It showed a much younger Miss Fortescue standing beside a tall man in military uniform outside what appeared to be a church. "Constable Lamb," she said quietly, "would you mind if I examined this photograph more closely?" The young officer joined her at the mantelpiece. "Don't recognize the gentleman, do you, Miss Marple?" "No, but there's something familiar about him. The uniform suggests World War service, which would place this photograph some 30 years ago." She paused, studying the image. "Notice how this frame has been moved recently. There's a dust outline where it usually sits, and it's now positioned differently from the others." They moved through to the kitchen, where Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the wastebasket. Among the usual domestic debris, she spotted a torn envelope with a London postmark. "The letter Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned," Constable Lamb said, carefully extracting the pieces. "Pemberton and Associates, Lincoln's Inn Fields." "Might I suggest," Miss Marple said delicately, "that you contact this firm? Legal correspondence often contains information that might explain unusual behavior." The bedroom, as Mrs. Clement had reported, showed no signs of recent occupancy. The bed was made with military precision, and Miss Fortescue's nightgown lay folded on the pillow. But Miss Marple noticed something that might have escaped a less observant eye. A suitcase was missing from the top of the wardrobe. The dust pattern clearly showed where one had recently been removed. She may have left voluntarily after all, Constable Lamb mused. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Though, if so, why leave the door open and the morning tea prepared? And why not inform anyone of her departure? They were interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Constable Lamb went to answer it, returning with a thin, nervous-looking man in his 50s, who Miss Marple recognized as Mr. Harold Binns, the village's part-time gardener and full-time gossip. "Begging your pardon, Constable," Mr. Binns said, wringing his cap in his hands, "but I heard you was investigating Miss Fortescue's disappearance, and I thought you ought to know. I seen something peculiar yesterday evening." "What sort of something, Mr. Binns?" "Well, I was walking past here around 8 o'clock, taking a shortcut from the Lamb and Flag, when I noticed a light in Miss Fortescue's sitting room. But the curtains were drawn tight, which struck me as odd. She never draws them until near bedtime, usually." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with the constable. "Did you see anyone else about, Mr. Binns?" "That's just it, miss. There was a motor car parked round the corner on Church Lane. Expensive-looking thing, not from the village. Had London plates, it did. Did you see who was driving it?" "No, miss, but I did notice the car was gone when I passed again near 9:30. Made me wonder if Miss Fortescue had unexpected visitors." Constable Lamb made careful notes, while Miss Marple pondered this new information. A London car, arriving when Miss Fortescue was known to be home, departing around the time she might normally have been preparing for bed. The timing aligned suspiciously with her apparent disappearance. "Mr. Binns," she inquired gently, "have you noticed this Mr. Peterson, who's staying at the Lamb and Flag? The gentleman Mrs. Bantry mentioned?" "Oh, yes, miss. Peculiar sort, if you ask me. Keeps asking questions about the village, particularly about folks who've lived here a long time. Yesterday he was asking Mrs. Mullet at the post office about Miss Fortescue specifically, wanted to know her routines when she went out, that sort of thing." The implications of this revelation settled over the small group like a morning fog. A stranger asking detailed questions about Miss Fortescue's habits, followed by her mysterious disappearance, painted an increasingly sinister picture. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "we should have a conversation with Mr. Peterson as soon as possible." As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple took one final look around the sitting room. Something nagged at her, a detail that seemed out of place, but which she couldn't quite identify. The room was too perfect, too undisturbed for someone who had supposedly packed and left voluntarily. In her long experience of human nature, people in distress rarely maintain such meticulous order. The morning was advancing, and with it, the mystery of Miss Fortescue's disappearance was deepening, rather than resolving. As they walked back toward the village center, Miss Marple reflected that in cases like these, the obvious suspect was often merely a convenient distraction from the truth. Mr. Peterson might indeed be involved, but she suspected the real answers lay closer to home, hidden among the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead's longtime residents. The question was, which of her neighbors was harboring secrets worth making someone disappear? Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The Lamb and Flag stood at the heart of St. Mary Mead's small commercial district. its Tudor beams and leaded windows giving it an air of comfortable antiquity that belied the sharp-eyed scrutiny of its proprietress, Mrs. Mullet. As Miss Marple and Constable Lamb approached the inn's heavy oak door, she emerged from behind the bar counter with the eager expression of someone who had been expecting their visit. "Come about that, Mr. Peterson, have you?" she said, without preamble. "I've been wondering when someone would start asking proper questions about him." Constable Lamb removed his helmet. "Is Mr. Peterson available to speak with us, Mrs. Mullet?" "That's just it. He's gone out. Left after breakfast this morning. Said he'd be back for lunch. But here's the peculiar thing." She lowered her voice, conspiratorially. "He paid his bill through the weekend yesterday evening. Seemed in quite a hurry about it, as if he might need to leave sudden-like." Miss Marple found this information troubling. "Did he say where he was going this morning?" "Said he had business in the village, but he was carrying a rather large travelling bag for local business, if you ask me. And he was dressed more formal than usual. Proper city clothes, not the casual attire he's been wearing." Mrs. Mullet led them through to the small private parlour, where Mr. Peterson had been taking his meals. The room was empty save for the lingering scent of expensive tobacco, and a copy of the Times folded precisely beside an empty coffee cup. "He's been asking questions," Mrs. Mullet continued, settling into a chair with obvious relish. "Not direct, mind you, but the sort of careful inquiries that make a person wonder. Particularly interested in long-time residents, who's lived here longest, who might remember events from 30 years back." 30 years? Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Did he mention any specific events?" "Not exactly, but he seemed especially curious about newcomers from that period. Asked if anyone had arrived in the village around 1925 and stayed permanently." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Constable Lamb. Miss Fortescue had arrived in St. Mary Mead in 1924 to take up her teaching position, making her precisely the sort of long-time resident who might remember significant events from that era. "Did Mr. Peterson show particular interest in Miss Fortescue?" the constable inquired. "Oh yes, very much so. Asked about her daily routines, where she lived, whether she lived alone. Said he was considering settling in the village himself and wanted to know about the sort of neighbors he might have." Mrs. Mullet's expression suggested she had found this explanation less than convincing. Miss Marple noticed something glinting beneath Mr. Peterson's chair. A small brass object that had apparently rolled under the furniture. She bent to retrieve it, finding herself holding an ornate military button, tarnished with age but still displaying the distinctive regimental markings of a World War infantry unit. "How curious," she murmured, turning the button over in her palm. "Constable Lamb, does this remind you of anything we've seen recently?" The young officer examined the button carefully. "It's the same regiment as the gentleman in Miss Fortescue's photograph, isn't it?" "Indeed it is. Which raises the question of how such a button came to be in Mr. Peterson's possession." Mrs. Mullet leaned forward with interest. "What photograph would that be?" Miss Marple described the military photograph they had noticed at Miss Fortescue's cottage, particularly noting how it had been recently handled. The gentleman in the photograph was wearing the uniform of this same regiment. It seems quite a coincidence that Mr. Peterson should have such a button in his possession. "Well," Mrs. Mullet said thoughtfully, "he did mention having served in the war, though he was vague about details, said he'd lost touch with most of his old comrades over the years." Constable Lamb pocketed the button carefully. We'll need to speak with Mr. Peterson when he returns. This could be significant evidence. As they prepared to leave the inn, Miss Marple paused at the front desk where the guest registry lay open. Mr. Peterson's entry was written in a careful, educated hand. James Peterson, London. But something about the signature nagged at her. A peculiar formation of the letters that seemed somehow familiar. "Mrs. Mullet," she said quietly, "might I ask you to look at this signature? Does anything about it strike you as unusual?" The innkeeper studied the registry entry. "Now that you mention it, there is something. See how he's written the P in Peterson. It's quite distinctive, almost like a B at first glance. My late husband used to say, you could tell a man's education by how he formed his capital letters. Marple felt a small thrill of recognition. She had seen that particular letter formation before, though she couldn't immediately place where. It was the sort of detail that would come to her eventually, usually at the most inconvenient moment. They emerged from the inn to find the village buzzing with additional news. Dr. Haydock was standing outside his surgery in animated conversation with the postman, both men wearing expressions of considerable concern. "Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock called out as he spotted her approach. "Might I have a word? Something rather troubling has come to light regarding Miss Fortescue." They gathered in the doctor's small consulting room, where he produced a leather appointment book from his desk drawer. "Miss Fortescue telephoned yesterday afternoon to make an urgent appointment for this morning," he began. "She seemed quite distressed and insisted on speaking with me immediately. When I explained I was fully booked until today, she said something rather peculiar." "What did she say?" Constable Lamb asked. "She said, 'Doctor, I've just learned something that changes everything I thought I knew about my past. I need your advice about what to do with information that could destroy someone's life.'" Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into new configurations. Did she give any indication of what sort of information she had discovered? Only that it concerned someone she had trusted completely, someone whose true identity had been hidden from her for years. She seemed frightened, Miss Marple, genuinely frightened, not of physical harm, but of what this knowledge might force her to do. The implications of Dr. Haydock's revelation cast the morning's events in an entirely new light. Miss Fortescue hadn't simply disappeared. She had been in possession of dangerous knowledge about someone's hidden identity. Knowledge that someone might kill to protect. As they walked back toward the village green, Miss Marple's mind worked furiously to connect the emerging threads of the mystery. A military button, a concealed identity, a legal letter from London, and a 30-year-old secret that someone was desperate to keep buried. The question was no longer simply where Miss Fortescue had gone, but whether she was still alive to tell her story. Chapter 6: Confrontations and Secrets. As they approached the village green, Miss Marple noticed an unusual gathering outside the post office. Several villagers stood in animated discussion, their voices carrying the particular urgency that accompanied significant news. Mrs. Price Ridley was at the center of the group, gesticulating dramatically, while Mrs. Bantry nodded with obvious satisfaction at being among the first to receive whatever information was being shared. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley called out as they drew near, "you simply must hear this. Young Jimmy from the telegraph office has just delivered the most extraordinary news." Constable Lamb quickened his pace, his official interest clearly aroused. "What sort of news, Mrs. Price Ridley?" "A telegram arrived this morning for Miss Fortescue, but since she's not at home to receive it, the postmaster asked Jimmy to bring it to the police station. But Jimmy couldn't find you there, so he brought it here instead." The postmaster, Mr. Weatherby, emerged from his shop, carrying a yellow telegram envelope. His usually jovial face was creased with concern as he handed it to Constable Lamb. "I took the liberty of opening it, given the circumstances," he said apologetically. "It's from that London legal firm, Pemberton and Associates. Rather urgent by the sound of it." Constable Lamb examined the telegram, his expression growing increasingly grave. "It's a request for Miss Fortescue to contact them immediately regarding matters of utmost importance concerning the estate of one Captain William Hartwell, deceased." Miss Marple felt a small shock of recognition. "Hartwell? That's the same surname as our Mrs. Hartwell at the cafe." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened with excitement. "Do you suppose there's a connection? How extraordinary if our cafe proprietress should be related to someone Miss Fortescue knew." "More than that," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Captain William Hartwell could very well be the gentleman in the military photograph we found at Miss Fortescue's cottage. The timing would be appropriate. A captain who served in the war and died some time afterward." Constable Lamb folded the telegram carefully. "We should speak with Mrs. Hartwell immediately. This could explain a great deal about recent events." As they made their way back toward the Bluebell Cafe, Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. Mrs. Hartwell had arrived in St. Mary Mead, claiming to be a widow whose husband had died in India. But if Captain William Hartwell had some connection to Miss Fortescue, and if his estate was now a matter of legal concern, then Mrs. Hartwell's carefully constructed story might be hiding more complex truths. The cafe appeared nearly empty when they arrived, with only Colonel Melrose remaining at his corner table, absorbed in what appeared to be the afternoon edition of the Times. Mrs. Hartwell looked up from behind the counter with obvious anxiety as they entered, her face paling when she recognized Constable Lamb's official bearing. "Mrs. Hartwell," the constable began formally, "we'd like to ask you some questions in connection with Miss Fortescue's disappearance." "Of course," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Though I can't imagine how I might help." Miss Marple studied the woman's face carefully, noting the telltale signs of someone under considerable strain. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you familiar with the name Captain William Hartwell?" The effect of this question was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Hartwell's hands flew to her throat, and she gripped the counter for support, as if her legs might fail her. "Where did you hear that name?" she gasped. "A telegram arrived for Miss Fortescue this morning from Pemberton and Associates in London, concerning Captain Hartwell's estate," Constable Lamb explained. "Given your shared surname, we wondered if there might be a connection." Mrs. Hartwell sank into the nearest chair, her carefully maintained composure finally crumbling. "Captain William Hartwell was my husband," she said, in a voice so quiet they had to strain to hear her. "My first husband, that is. He died in France in 1918. "But you told everyone your husband died in India," Mrs. Bantry interjected, having followed them from the post office with undisguised curiosity. "My second husband died in India," Mrs. Hartwell corrected miserably. "I married again in 1920. Harold Hartwell, William's younger brother. It seemed Simpler to speak of only one husband when I came here. Widowhood is complicated enough without explaining multiple marriages. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. Mrs. Hartwell, had Miss Fortescue known your first husband? Is that why she seemed so interested when you arrived in the village? Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how she could have known William. He died so young, and I was barely 20 when I lost him. But yesterday... She paused, struggling with her words. Yesterday she asked me the most peculiar questions. She wanted to know William's middle name, his regimental number, details that only someone who knew him well could possibly want to know. What did you tell her? Constable Lamb asked. I told her everything she asked. She seemed so certain, so convinced that she had the right to know. She said she had received information that suggested William might not have died when and where. I believed he had. The cafe fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture. Though the complete image remained frustratingly unclear, Mrs. Hartwell, she said carefully, did Miss Fortescue suggest what this information might be? She said she had been contacted by someone who claimed to have served with William. Someone who had recently learned she was living in St. Mary Mead. This person apparently had documents that proved William had survived the war, that his death had been falsely reported. Colonel Melrose, who had been listening with increasing attention from his corner table, suddenly spoke up. Good God, Mrs. Hartwell, are you suggesting your husband might still be alive? I don't know what to think anymore. Mrs. Hartwell sobbed. Miss Fortescue was convinced that someone had been living under false pretenses for 30 years, and that this person might be dangerous if exposed. She said she needed to be very careful about how she handled the information. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful look with Constable Lamb. If Miss Fortescue had believed Captain William Hartwell was still alive, and if she had been preparing to expose someone who had been living under a false identity for 3 decades, then her disappearance took on an entirely different and far more sinister character. The question now was whether the mysterious Mr. Peterson was the surviving Captain Hartwell, or whether someone else entirely had been living a lie that was worth killing to protect. Chapter 7. Another twist. The afternoon had taken on an oppressive quality that seemed to mirror the darkening mood in the Bluebell Café. Mrs. Hartwell sat hunched in her chair, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while the small group around her processed the implications of her revelations. Miss Marple found herself studying each face in turn, noting the various expressions of surprise, concern, and what might have been calculation. It was Colonel Melrose who broke the heavy silence. Mrs. Hartwell, I feel compelled to ask, do you have any idea who this mysterious correspondent might be? The person who claimed to have served with your husband? Miss Fortescue wouldn't tell me, Mrs. Hartwell replied shakily. She said it would be safer for everyone if she handled the matter herself. But she did mention that this person had been living in England under an assumed name since the war ended. Constable Lamb looked up from his notebook. Did she say whether this person was living locally? She wasn't specific, but I had the impression, yes, I think she believed this person might be someone she encountered regularly. She kept saying how shocking it was that someone could maintain such a deception for so long, right under everyone's noses. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. If Miss Fortescue had believed the false Captain Hartwell was someone in her daily life, someone she met regularly. Then the list of potential suspects had just narrowed considerably and become far more dangerous. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said gently, "when did Miss Fortescue first approach you with these questions about your late husband?" "It was 2 days ago, in the evening. She came to my flat above the cafe just as I was closing up. She seemed quite agitated and asked if she could speak with me privately about a delicate matter." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "What exactly did she say?" "She told me she had received a letter from London, from that legal firm, I suppose, asking her to verify certain information about residents of St. Mary Mead. Specifically, they wanted to know if she was acquainted with the widow of Captain William Hartwell." This revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the small gathering. Miss Marple's mind immediately began working through the implications. If the legal firm had contacted Miss Fortescue as a long-term village resident to verify Mrs. Hartwell's identity, it suggested that someone had raised questions about the authenticity of Captain Hartwell's reported death. Did the letter explain why they needed this verification? Constable Lamb inquired. Miss Fortescue said it concerned a significant inheritance that had recently come to light. Apparently, a distant relative of Captain Hartwell had died and left a substantial estate, but the inheritance could only be claimed if Captain Hartwell's death could be definitively proven. "And could it be?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell's face crumpled again. "That's just it. I never received official notification of William's death. I was told by his commanding officer that he had been killed in action and buried in France. But I never saw a death certificate or a grave marker. At the time, I was so young and grief-stricken that I didn't think to question the official word." For seat, cafe door chimed suddenly, admitting Dr. Haydock, who appeared considerably more agitated than his usual composed self. He spotted their gathering and hurried over, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "Constable Lamb, thank goodness I've found you," he said breathlessly. "I've just received the most disturbing telephone call from the hospital in the county town. A man was admitted there early this morning, unconscious and suffering from what appears to be a severe head injury." "What does this have to do with our investigation?" the constable asked. "The man was found beside a railway, cutting about 5 miles from here, apparently having fallen or been pushed from a moving train. But here's the crucial detail. He was carrying identification papers in the name of James Peterson." A collective gasp arose from the group. Miss Marple felt the familiar sensation of puzzle pieces suddenly shifting into a new and unexpected configuration. "Is he conscious?" she asked. "He regained consciousness about an hour ago, but he's suffering from significant memory loss. However, he's been asking repeatedly for someone named Margaret, and he keeps mentioning St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Hartwell looked up sharply. "Margaret? But that was Miss Fortescue's Christian name. She mentioned it once when I complimented her on the brass nameplate by her front door." The implications of this discovery hung heavy in the afternoon air. If Mr. Peterson was lying unconscious in a hospital, then who was the well-dressed stranger who had been asking questions about the village? And more importantly, what had happened to Miss Fortescue? "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said with characteristic directness, "did this injured man have any other identifying marks or possessions?" "Several items of interest, actually. An old military medal with the same regimental markings as that button you found, Constable. and most peculiar of all, a photograph of a young woman in 1920s dress, inscribed on the back with, "To dear William, with all my love, Margaret." The photograph's existence sent shockwaves through the assembled group. If Mr. Peterson possessed a photograph of Miss Fortescue from 30 years ago, addressed to someone named William, then the mystery had taken yet another bewildering turn. "There's more," Dr. Haydock continued. "The hospital staff found evidence that this man had been systematically changing his appearance. Hair dye, padding to alter his build, even dental work to modify his bite. Whatever identity he's been living under, it's been carefully constructed and maintained over many years." Miss Marple rose from her chair, her mind working furiously to process these latest revelations. "Dr. Haydock, is this man well enough to answer questions?" "The doctors believe so, though they warn his memory may be unreliable due to the head injury. But Miss Marple, there's something else, something that might explain Miss Fortescue's disappearance." He paused dramatically, clearly struggling with the weight of his next words. "The railway authorities found evidence of a struggle in one of the carriages. There were signs that someone else had been on that train. Someone who may have left, voluntarily or—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. As the group absorbed this latest twist, Miss Marple found herself reconsidering everything they had learned. If Mr. Peterson was indeed Captain William Hartwell, and if he had been travelling with Miss Fortescue, then either she was his willing companion or his victim. The question that remained was whether the reunion of two people who had clearly cared for each other decades ago had ended in reconciliation or tragedy. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The drive to the county hospital passed in contemplative silence, with Miss Marple seated beside Dr. Haydock in his motor car, while Constable Lamb followed on his bicycle. The afternoon light was fading rapidly, casting long shadows across the countryside that seemed to mirror the darkness at the heart of their investigation. Miss Marple used the journey to organize her thoughts, preparing for what she suspected would be the most crucial conversation of the entire affair. The hospital ward was quiet when they arrived, visiting hours nearly over, and the corridors filled with the efficient bustle of evening preparations. Dr. Haydock led them to a private room where a man lay propped against white pillows, his head wrapped in bandages and his face bearing the pallor of recent trauma. Despite the injuries and the obvious effects of years spent altering his appearance, Miss Marple could see traces of the young soldier from the photograph in Miss Fortescue's sitting room. The bone structure was the same, though fuller now, and the eyes, when they opened to regard his visitors, held the particular wariness of someone who had carried a heavy secret for far too long. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Haydock said gently, "these people are here to help find Miss Fortescue. Do you feel well enough to speak with them?" The man's eyes sharpened with obvious concern. "Margaret, is she safe? Please tell me she's safe." Miss Marple moved closer to the bedside, her voice taking on the particular gentle firmness she reserved for moments of critical importance. "That's what we're trying to determine, Mr. Peterson. Or should I say, Captain Hartwell." A flicker of something, relief perhaps or resignation, crossed his features. "You know then? After all these years of hiding, someone finally knows." "We know some of it," Miss Marple replied carefully. "But we need to understand what happened yesterday evening. and why Miss Fortescue is missing. The man calling himself Peterson closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for a confession he had perhaps been waiting 30 years to make. My name is William Hartwell. I was reported killed in France in 1918, but that report was false. I was severely wounded and suffered complete memory loss for nearly 2 years. By the time I recovered, my supposed widow had remarried my own brother, and I couldn't bring myself to destroy her new life. Constable Lamb leaned forward. So, you assumed a false identity. I became James Peterson, taking papers from a comrade who had died with no family to mourn him. I moved to London, built a new life, told myself it was for the best. His voice carried the weight of decades of self-doubt. But when Harold died in India, and Vivian came to England, I began watching from a distance, making sure she was well, cared for. Miss Marple felt pieces clicking into place. You were the one who arranged for her to hear about the cafe for sale in St. Mary Mead. You wanted her settled somewhere peaceful. Yes. I thought I could remain anonymous, perhaps occasionally see her from a distance. But then the inheritance matter arose. My great-uncle's estate in Scotland. The solicitors needed to verify my death conclusively before the inheritance could pass to distant cousins. And they contacted Miss Fortescue as a long-time village resident who might know Mrs. Hartwell. Miss Marple concluded. William Hartwell nodded weakly. Margaret was always the most observant person in any room. When she began asking questions about Vivian's first husband, I knew it was only a matter of time before she connected the dots. She had an excellent memory for faces, even after 30 years. So you contacted her directly? Constable Lamb asked. I wrote to her, explaining everything, asking for a private meeting. I thought if I could explain why I had maintained the deception, she might understand. She agreed to meet me at the railway station yesterday evening. Miss Marple studied his face carefully, watching for the telltale signs of deception. What happened during that meeting, Captain Hartwell? His expression grew anguished. She was angry at first. Angry that I had let Vivian believe she was a widow. Angry that I had lived a lie for so long. But then she began to understand the impossibility of my position. How could I return from the dead and destroy my brother's marriage? Did she agree to keep your secret? Miss Marple inquired gently. She said she needed time to think, to decide what was right. We boarded the London train together. She wanted to see the solicitor's documents herself, to understand the full legal implications. His voice became strained. But during the journey, she became convinced that someone was following us. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional concern. Following you? Who? Margaret was certain she had seen someone from the village board the train at the last moment. Someone who might have overheard our conversation or discovered our meeting. Somehow, she became increasingly agitated, saying that if the wrong person learned the truth, it could destroy more than just Vivian's peace of mind. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. What did she mean by that? She said there was someone in St. Mary Mead who had been living their own lie. Someone who would be exposed if the truth about my identity came to light. She was frightened, Miss Marple, genuinely frightened of what this person might do to protect their secret. Constable Lamb exchanged glances with Miss Marple. Did she say who this person was? William Hartwell's eyes filled with anguish. She was about to tell me when the train went round a sharp curve. There was a sudden commotion in the corridor outside our compartment. Shouting, the sound of a struggle. Margaret opened the door to investigate and he stopped, his breathing becoming labored. "Take your time," Miss Marple said softly. Someone pushed past her. I couldn't see who in the dim light. Margaret stumbled backward, struck her head on the window frame. I tried to catch her, but I was thrown off balance myself. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up here. The lecture hospital room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Miss Marple absorbed this account, her mind working through the implications. If Miss Fortescue had indeed discovered another false identity in St. Mary Mead, then her disappearance might be the work of someone desperate to prevent their own 30-year deception from being exposed. The question that remained was which of her neighbors had been living a lie worth killing to protect, and whether Miss Fortescue was still alive to reveal the truth. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The return journey to St. Mary Mead took place in gathering dusk, with Miss Marple's mind working furiously through the final pieces of the puzzle. She had requested that Constable Lamb gather everyone who had been at the cafe that morning back to the Bluebell for what she termed a final clarification of events. As Dr. Haydock's motorcar wound through the familiar village streets, she felt the peculiar certainty that came when a complex pattern finally revealed its underlying logic. The cafe was unusually crowded when they arrived, with Mrs. Hartwell having closed early to accommodate the unusual gathering. Colonel Melrose sat in his customary corner, though his usual composure seemed strained. Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley occupied the center table, their voices hushed, but their eyes bright with anticipation. Dr. Haydock's wife, Sarah, sat near the window, nervously stirring a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Mrs. Hartwell moved between the tables with obvious anxiety, her hands trembling as she served refreshments that no one seemed particularly interested in consuming. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation and barely concealed fear. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the back of the cafe, positioning herself where she could observe every face in the room. Constable Lamb stood near the door, his notebook ready and his expression officially grave. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began in her gentle but carrying voice. "I believe we can now shed light on Miss Fortescue's disappearance, though I fear the truth is more complex than any of us initially suspected." She paused, allowing her gaze to travel slowly around the room, noting reactions. The key to understanding this mystery lies not in the present, but in events that occurred 30 years ago during the Great War. Events that have cast shadows over several lives and ultimately led to yesterday's tragedy. Mrs. Hartwell set down her tea tray with shaking hands. "Miss Marple, surely you don't mean to suggest that ancient history has anything to do with poor Miss Fortescue's disappearance? On the contrary, my dear, I believe the past is everything in this case." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "You see, Miss Fortescue discovered that not one, but two people in St. Mary Mead had been living under false identities since the war ended." A collective intake of breath greeted this statement. Colonel Melrose lowered his newspaper with a sharp rustle, while Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "We now know that Mr. Peterson was actually Captain William Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell's first husband who survived the war. but chose to remain officially dead rather than disrupt his brother's marriage. His motives, while misguided, were fundamentally honorable. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded understanding. However, Miss Marple continued, Miss Fortescue realized that William's return to the area might expose someone else's carefully maintained deception. Someone who had far more sinister reasons for assuming a false identity. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small object. The distinctive military button they had found at the Lamb and Flag. This button belongs to the same regiment as Captain Hartwell, but it didn't fall from his clothing. It was deliberately planted to create suspicion around him. Constable Lamb stepped forward. Planted by whom, Miss Marple? By someone who knew that if questions began being asked about wartime identities, their own false persona might crumble under scrutiny. Someone who had been watching and waiting, growing increasingly desperate as Miss Fortescue's investigation threatened to expose them. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Dr. Haydock's wife Sarah, who had grown pale and rigid in her chair. Someone who had access to military memorabilia through her husband's war service, and who would have known exactly where to find Mr. Peterson staying in the village. Sarah Haydock's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. I don't know what you're suggesting, Miss Marple, but I'm suggesting, my dear, that you are not Sarah Haydock at all, that the real Sarah died in the influenza epidemic of 1919, and that you assumed her identity to escape a rather different sort of death. The cafe erupted in shocked murmurs, but Miss Marple continued relentlessly. You see, I recognized your handwriting yesterday when we examined the guest registry at the Lamb and Flag. That distinctive formation of capital letters that Mrs. Mullet commented upon. I had seen it before, many years ago, on correspondence from someone who was facing trial for war profiteering. Someone who mysteriously disappeared before she could face justice. Sarah Haydock, or whoever she truly was, rose from her chair with sudden violence, her facade of gentle respectability falling away entirely. You meddling old woman, you have no proof of any of this. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied calmly, I have Miss Fortescue's final message. You see, she didn't simply disappear on that train. She managed to post a letter at the last station, before your confrontation with her. Constable Lamb produced an envelope from his pocket. This arrived at the post office this morning, Miss Marple, addressed to you personally. As he opened Miss Fortescue's letter, the woman who had called, herself Sarah Haydock, made a sudden dash for the door, but Colonel Melrose, moving with surprising agility for his age, blocked her path, while Constable Lamb quickly restrained her. Miss Marple read aloud from the letter. Dear Miss Marple, if you are reading this, then my fears about our Mrs. Haydock have proved correct. I have discovered that she is actually Lillian Thorne, who was wanted for selling defective medical supplies to the army during the war. Supplies that caused the deaths of dozens of soldiers. She assumed poor Sarah's identity after Sarah died of influenza and has been hiding in plain sight ever since. I am traveling to London to verify this information, but I fear she may have realized I suspect her. If anything happens to me, look for the truth in the old newspaper files at the county library. Your friend in justice, Margaret Fortescue. The woman now revealed as Lillian Thorne had collapsed into Constable Lamb's custody, her years of careful deception finally at an end. But the question that haunted the silent cafe was whether her desperate attempt to protect her secret had cost Miss Fortescue her life. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her expression grave. "Constable Lamb, I believe we must search for Miss Fortescue along the railway line. If she posted this letter, she may have survived the initial attack." Chapter 10. Aftermath. The search for Miss Fortescue began at first light the following morning, with teams organized along the railway line between St. Mary Mead and the county town. Miss Marple had insisted on accompanying the search party, despite Constable Lamb's gentle protests about the rough terrain, her intuition telling her that Miss Fortescue's survival instincts would have guided her to shelter rather than exposure. It was young Dr. Haydock who found her, unconscious but alive, in a railway worker's hut approximately 3 miles from where William Hartwell had been discovered. She had suffered a severe concussion and exposure during the cold October night, but her pulse was steady and her breathing regular. As they carefully transported her to the village surgery, Miss Marple reflected on the remarkable fortitude of a 70-year-old retired schoolmistress who had managed to escape a determined killer and survive nearly 24 hours in the countryside. Miss Fortescue regained consciousness late that afternoon, her first words being a request for news of Captain Hartwell's condition. When assured that he was recovering well and that Lillian Thorne had been arrested, she managed a weak smile that transformed her usually stern features. "I should have suspected her years ago," she said, her voice hoarse but determined. There were always small inconsistencies in her stories about her past, little details that didn't quite align, but she seemed so perfectly suited to be a doctor's wife that I dismissed my doubts. Miss Marple sat beside the sick bed, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked. "How did you first realize her true identity, my dear?" "It was the handwriting, just as you discovered. When I saw her sign the visitor's book at the church jumble sale last month, something about the formation of her letters struck me as familiar. I couldn't place it immediately, but it nagged at me for weeks." Miss Fortescue paused, gathering strength before continuing. "Then, when the legal inquiries began about Captain Hartwell, I started thinking about other people who might have assumed false identities during the war. I remembered reading about Lillian Thorne's case in the newspapers, how she had disappeared before her trial, how the authorities had never managed to track her down. What convinced you to investigate further?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "I went to the county library and researched the old newspaper accounts. There was a photograph of Lillian Thorne from her arrest, and despite the years and the changes she had made to her appearance, I recognized her. The bone structure, the way she held her head, they were unmistakable once I knew what to look for." Dr. Haydock entered the surgery quietly, carrying a tea tray and wearing an expression of profound relief mixed with bewilderment. "Miss Fortescue, I cannot begin to express my shock at discovering that the woman I believed to be my wife was actually a wanted criminal. I feel I should have known, should have suspected something." "My dear doctor," Miss Fortescue said kindly, "you fell in love with the person she presented herself to be. Lillian Thorne was clearly an accomplished actress, capable of maintaining her deception for over 30 years. You mustn't blame yourself for her crimes." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Dr. Haydock, how did you come to marry her? Or if you don't mind my asking." "We met in 1920, just after I returned from France and established my practice here. She had recently arrived in the village, claiming to be a war widow named Sarah Haydock. She seemed so vulnerable, so in need of protection. I suppose I fancied myself her rescuer. She chose her new identity carefully. Miss Fortescue observed. The real Sarah Haydock had no family to question the deception. And her death, from influenza, would have been recorded but not widely known outside her immediate area. Constable Lamb appeared in the doorway, his notebook in hand, and his expression satisfied. Miss Fortescue, I wanted to inform you that we've received confirmation from London. Lillian Thorne has confessed to assuming Sarah Haydock's identity, and the authorities there are eager to finally close her case. What will happen to her? Dr. Haydock asked quietly. She'll face trial for the original war profiteering charges, as well as attempted murder in your case, Miss Fortescue. The evidence is quite overwhelming, particularly with Captain Hartwell's testimony about the events on the train. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression thoughtful. Constable Lamb, what of Captain Hartwell and Mrs. Hartwell? This revelation must have been quite overwhelming for both of them. Actually, Miss Marple, that's turned out rather well. They've agreed to meet this evening with Mrs. Hartwell's consent to hear his full story. She's expressed understanding about his difficult position, and they're discussing how to move forward now that the truth is known. Miss Fortescue struggled to sit up straighter. And the inheritance matter. The solicitors are satisfied that Captain Hartwell's survival can be legally documented, which resolves the estate questions. He's indicated that he wishes to remain in the area, perhaps to rebuild his relationship with Mrs. Hartwell, though obviously much has changed since their youth. As the afternoon light faded, casting long shadows through the surgery windows, Miss Marple reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this resolution. A case that had begun with a simple absence from morning tea had revealed decades of deception, hidden identities, and the long shadows cast by wartime traumas. Miss Fortescue, she said quietly, I must ask, when you realized the danger you were in on that train, what made you think to post that letter? Partly intuition, partly fear, Miss Fortescue replied, but mostly the knowledge that if something happened to me, you would be the one person in St. Mary Mead capable of seeing through Lillian Thorne's deception. You have always understood that people are rarely exactly what they appear to be. Miss Marple smiled, returning to her knitting. Indeed, my dear. In my experience, the most dangerous people are often those who seem the most harmless. It's a lesson worth remembering. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead was settling into its evening routine, though perhaps with a new awareness that even the most peaceful communities could harbor the darkest secrets. The Bluebell Café would reopen tomorrow under Mrs. Hartwell's management. Life would continue its familiar patterns. But the events of the past 2 days had reminded everyone that beneath the surface of ordinary life, extraordinary stories of human nature continued to unfold.